Okay, so what are the theoretical implications of orientation-dependent after effects and the crowd? So as we have been discussing about this relationship between V1 and consciousness, and it's kind of complex, but then we are now coming to this theoretical implication part. So orientation-dependent after effects and the crowding. The key so far is that it's phenomenology. Orientation itself is invisible due to the crowding. And then experimental data suggests that adaptation effects are as strong as the visible case. The invisible and the visible doesn't matter. Second, that a simple model of adaptation effects exists. So that means that if one population of neuron gets fatigued, then with respect to the other, it's relatively weaker. So you need stronger stimulus to see things, or your perception gets distorted according to that. And then another thing is that the orientation processes starts to happen after V1. And then crowding is also based on the stimulus property. You can make it bigger or smaller, and then you can cause, imagine that this particular part of the experiment are likely to happen after V1. So some processing in V1 that does not correlate with the consciousness because of the crowding, but during the adaptation is still responsible for after effects selectively. So if this is the case, then what's happening in V1 doesn't really corresponding to our experience. If this crowding is, if the orientation processing that is responsible for after effects is happening after V1, then it's not reflecting this invisibility. So the adaptation is an important tool in consciousness research. Adaptation can cause vivid alteration of conscious phenomenology without changing the stimulus. So this is basically the fixed neural correlates of the stimulus with varied neural correlates of consciousness and behavior, right? And then if the adaptation is caused by specific neurons, it can be used to infer where in the brain the adaptation is happening. And then adaptation can be combined with the independent manipulation of consciousness and attention, as we see in the later part of this video. So theoretical consideration-wise, this experiment has been used as our argument for the MCC is not in the V1. V1 has no, and also this has been claimed based on the next kind of component. V1 has no direct projection to the prefrontal and premotor cortical areas. And the various empirical chapter evidence revealing quest for consciousness. So this diagram is so-called V1 hypothesis by Francis Crick and Christoph Paul. And they argued basically that MCC is not in the V1. And one part of the argument is that V1 does not directly, connect to premotor or prefrontal cortical areas, which is important for movement and thoughts, and also working memory and things like that. That is our reportable contents of consciousness. So they hypothesized that visual awareness is probably happening in terms of the relationship or interaction between these prefrontal premotor cortical areas and higher visual areas, but not with V1. And then various empirical evidence has been reviewed within the quest for consciousness in chapter 6. So other evidence that is in favor of the V1 as not the MCC includes the following. One is that during the dreaming, it seems like during the REM episode especially, V1 neurons seems to be suppressed. So if it's generating the dream experience, why do we see the suppression? That's the idea. And then also V1 neurons properties do not follow properties of consciousness in various ways. One is that, as I said, a layer 4 neurons at least definitely has an eye of origin information. But interestingly, if you are in the dark room and then presented with a particular light that is presented through your right eye or left eye. You can do it with a goggle right now. Then it turns out that you don't have an access to the origin of the eye about the information. So you can't tell whether the light is coming from right eye or left eye. Right now you can to some extent by doing this, because right eye and the left eye has an overall difference in terms of visual field, input and so on. But if the input is presented at a particular location with a controlled manner, then the information that should be available within V1, like which particular neuron is becoming active or not, it's not really consciously accessible. Okay. Another piece of the evidence is that the V1 cells are affected by blinks and eye movements. As we looked in the last weeks, eye movements shuts down the response, right, before and after. And so we become temporarily blind while we are making the eye movements, but we usually don't notice that, this blacking of the vision. And that's probably because overall across the visual brain, there is some kind of editing and copying and pasting of the some kind of state of the neurons that supports for conscious vision. But V1 neurons, if you can recall it, it turns out that the V1's neurons becomes active and suppressed and so on at the time of the blink and also eye movements. Precisely the way that you would expect that camera or a pixel of the cell phone should be responding. If you blink, then your V1 neurons goes down in terms of activation, and if you make an eye movements following this eye movement related visual blurring and so on, the V1 neurons also changes its response, right? So that doesn't just coincide with our conscious experience of the vision. And then orientation dependent after effects under the crowd. However, there are lots of key issues before making a final conclusion. One is that we said that adaptation effects are as strong as the visible cases, right? But is it really so? That's one question mark. And another one is that this simple model of adaptation, is it really realistic? That's something that we need to think about. Okay, so the first issue about is invisible after effects as strong as visible one. If crowding or invisibility reduces the effective stimulus strength, in fact, then the results are completely consistent with the expected result from this simple model, another simple model. So here you see that I said that there was no difference in the effect, but some of you might say that, oh, there is maybe some kind of small difference, reduction. So according to this simple model, if we were to use weaker adapting contrast, maybe we were able to see the difference in after effect strengths much easier. And Randolph Break did this experiment indeed. So what they found was that this effect of the visibility. So you can actually just focus on this single adapter versus crowded condition using very high contrast adaptation stimulus, as done in the original study. Then single stimulus versus crowding stimulus generate the same level of threshold elevation, as basically replicating the result. However, if they use a much weaker adapter contrast, then there was a significant difference between the visible single condition versus weaker crowded condition. So that means that the initial claim that visibility doesn't matter for this effect of the after effect is not really sustained anymore. It was a particular case of the adaptation condition where stimulus was very strong to see the sort of saturation in terms of the effect of the visibility. If you weaken the stimulus, then we are now sensitive to detect the effect of the visibility in this, After Effects experiment. That's the idea. Also, in terms of the models of adaptation, maybe there has been bias in the research in selecting which neurons to record and analyze. And so what I mean is that this popular model of the adaptation, where we present one particular stimulus and then see the response to go down at the adapted location and so on, and then accordingly many population of neurons that are close to this adapted stimulus reduces its response like this way and so on, is highly biased by the previous experimental selection. So if you theoretically think about different kinds of the adaptation mechanism, indeed, there are many ways to explain the adaptation phenomena, and its combination of many of this model can also account for our adaptation phenomenology and also recorded neural activity. And to address this, we need to do the simultaneous neural recording, but that kind of data is usually not available yet. But that needs to come next, next generation of the neuroscience research. And still, also we need to reconcile with the phenomenology. And all these models are usually explaining or trying to, stimulus versus brain response level of the relationship. What we need is that the brain response to the consciousness type of the relationship, and that's also not really available at this stage, especially with the recording of the neurons. But this kind of problem is not really insurmountable problem. As we reviewed recently, the number of the neural recording sites are increasing really quickly. Around 1950s, it was already difficult to find the neurons, a single neuron to record one at a time. But then after 40 years, people started to record a handful of the neurons. And then within 2010 and now it's 2020, like here, the number of the simultaneously recordable neurons increased really tremendously. So we no longer need to select neurons to record to see whether your particular hypothesis is correct or not, but just record everything and then see whether that coincides with the phenomenology or not by further analysis. And this is called the neuropixel probes, and that using only one probe to penetrate brain in a rat, you can already record just by like one electrode record 340 neurons, and then each of the neurons firing is depicted like this way, and then that can be inserted in many areas of the brain, in principle. So that will change the neuroscience, and especially for this type of modeling studies, prediction and validation in modeling the phenomenology and the behavior. So and also another coming back from these issues, NCC is not in the brain, and V1 has no direct projection to the prefrontal and premotor cortical areas. This kind of hypothesis is also now in a retrospect strongly biased with the view that the reported contents itself is consciousness. And there has been many different kind of reasons why this can be concluded as such, like Frank Tong's Nature Review Neuroscience, or Polen has been also arguing against this kind of view. And we need to revisit this V1 hypothesis definitely. So in summary, Crick and Kopp's V1 hypothesis still promoted various empirical research. And one of the research outcome was this orientation-dependent invisible crowding effect, which itself revealed a lot of visual processing and also phenomenology. And however, reported and reportable contents often contradicting the V1's responses, and that supports the Crick and Cox conjecture of the V1 hypothesis still. But largely speaking, exact relationship between the V1 and the consciousness remains still unclear. So that needs to be revisited as well in the research. Having said that, we can apply the same kind of logic and make lots of progress by looking at other areas of the brain beyond V1. And that's what we are going to do in the next videos.